The first time Jeremiah Sutton noticed the smoke curling from the old Harding cabin on the eastern edge of his property, he assumed it was drifters passing through, and he told himself he would ride out there in the morning to send them on their way. That was in the spring of 1878, and the morning he planned to ride out never quite arrived. There was always something more pressing on the Sutton ranch. A fence lying down along the creek, a heifer in trouble with a breech calf, a wagon wheel that needed the iron rim reset before the next supply run into Caldwell, Kansas. Jeremiah was a man who lived inside his work the way other men lived inside their homes, finding in the daily labor of the land a kind of shelter that four walls and a roof had never quite provided him. He was 32 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of driving posts and hauling hay, with dark hair that had started to silver at the temples, and eyes the particular shade of gray that the Kansas sky turned before a serious storm. He was not unkind. He was not cruel. He was simply a man who had learned, through a series of disappointments that he kept carefully tucked away behind the wall of his daily industriousness, not to expect very much from the world beyond what his own two hands could wring from it. He had been engaged once, 7 years before, to a woman named Clara Briggs whose father owned the feed store in town. Clara had been pretty and light-tempered, and she had laughed at things Jeremiah said in a way that made him feel clever, which was not a feeling he was accustomed to. Then her father's store had burned down in the summer of 1871, and Clara's family had packed what remained of their lives into 2 wagons and headed east toward relatives in Missouri. And Clara had gone with them because that is what daughters did in those years. She had written him one letter, a careful and apologetic letter that he had read so many times the paper had gone soft along the fold lines, and then she had written nothing more. He had waited through 2 full seasons before he accepted that waiting was all he would ever do if he kept at it, and then he had turned his face back toward the land with a kind of grim finality that his ranch hands. A lean older cowboy named Pete Dawes, and a younger Mexican man named Rodrigo Vega, recognized as the particular loneliness of a man who has decided to stop hoping. So when the smoke continued to rise from the old Harding cabin through April and into May, Jeremiah noted it the way a man notes whether he cannot change, a fact of the landscape. Not his business precisely, since the cabin sat on land that was technically within the boundary survey of the Sutton property, but had been left derelict for 6 years since old Walt Harding had died of a rattlesnake bite while checking his south pasture. The cabin had no legal claim attached to it that Jeremiah knew of, and he had no particular use for the structure himself. He had been meaning to tear it down and salvage the timber. He simply had not gotten around to it. It was Pete Dawes who first told him her name. Pete had ridden into town for flour and salt and returned with the news the way he always returned with news, folded into the middle of some longer practical report so that it did not seem like gossip. "Millerson at the dry goods says there is a widow woman living out at the old Harding place," Pete said, unsaddling his horse and not looking at Jeremiah directly. "Name of Ford, Ellen Ford, came down from Wichita sometime last winter, the way he heard it. Bought herself a couple of laying hens and a milk goat, and has been getting along quiet as you please." "Ford," Jeremiah repeated, testing the name without particular interest. "Millerson says she is about 25 or thereabouts. Keeps to herself mostly. Pays her bills on time, which he seemed to find worth remarking on." Jeremiah had grunted and gone back to the bridle he was mending, and that had been, as far as he was concerned, the end of the conversation. But the human mind does not always take direction well, and in the weeks that followed, Jeremiah found his thoughts wandering occasionally to the question of what would bring a widow woman alone to the crumbling edges of his land in the middle of a Kansas winter. He did not pursue the question with any urgency. It was merely the idle wonder of a man whose evenings had grown very quiet since Rodrigo had married a woman from the Mexican settlement south of town and stopped sleeping in the bunkhouse. Pete still ate supper with Jeremiah most nights, but Pete was a man of few words, and their meals together had the comfortable, uncomplicated silence of two people who have nothing left to prove to each other. Through the summer, Jeremiah saw her once from a distance. He was riding the fence line along the eastern boundary in late July, checking for the damage a thunderstorm had done the previous night, and he looked up from where he had been crouching to examine a broken post and saw a woman walking through the tall grass on the far side of the fence. She was carrying a bucket, moving with the unhurried purpose of someone engaged in a task she had performed many times. She was wearing a blue cotton dress, and the morning sun was behind her, so she was mostly silhouette, the shape of a woman going about her business in the wide Kansas morning. She did not look toward him, or if she did, she gave no sign of it. Jeremiah stood, and for one entirely uncharacteristic moment he considered calling out to her. Instead, he turned back to the broken post and drove it back into the earth with the butt of his fence tool, and by the time he looked up again, she was gone. The months turned. August came with its heavy heat that pressed down on the grasslands like a hand, and September brought the first welcome coolness and the particular golden light that fell across the plains before the world burned itself down to amber and rust. Rodrigo's wife, a warm-faced woman named Consuela who had taken it upon herself to worry about Jeremiah in a maternal way that he found both touching and mildly embarrassing, began occasionally sending food to the main house through Rodrigo tamales wrapped in cloth, or a small jar of her pickled peppers. Jeremiah always sent back his genuine thanks and a small practical gift in return, a sack of sugar once, a length of good ribbon another time, because he was not a man who accepted kindness without acknowledgement. It was Consuela, as it turned out, who first made him think of Ellen Ford as a person rather than a fact of geography. She had come to the house one October afternoon to return a pot she had borrowed, and she sat for a few minutes at Jeremiah's kitchen table with the frankness of a woman who has decided that social formality is a luxury she does not have time for. "I spoke with the Ford woman at the market last Saturday," she said, warming her hands around the cup of coffee Jeremiah set before her. "Ellen, she is a good woman, Jeremiah. She is having a hard time of it." "What kind of hard time?" he asked, sitting across from her. "The cabin roof is letting in water. She told me she has been patching it herself with what she can find, but she is not a carpenter and the winters here are serious." Consuela looked at him with the particular directness of someone who is making a point but will not make it loudly. She lost her husband 2 years ago. He was a farmer up near Wichita, but they had trouble with the land and then he got sick and there was nothing to be done. She came south looking for cheaper land, and the old cabin was empty. "She is living on my land without any arrangement," Jeremiah said, but he said it without heat. Consuela looked at him over her coffee cup in a way that communicated quite clearly what she thought of that observation. "I will ride out and speak with her," Jeremiah said. "That would be the Christian thing to do," Consuela agreed serenely, and took another sip of her coffee. He did not ride out that week. There was a problem with one of the wells, and then a buyer came up from Oklahoma Territory looking to purchase 20 head of cattle, and the negotiations stretched across 3 days. But the knowledge that there was a woman living alone in a leaking cabin at the edge of his land had lodged itself in his conscience with the persistence of a splinter, and he could not quite leave it alone. On a gray Thursday in late October, with the smell of coming cold sharp in the air, Jeremiah saddled his horse and rode east. The old Harding cabin was small and stubborn-looking, like something that had refused to fall down out of sheer contrariness. The log walls were dark with age and weather, but someone had clearly worked on them recently. He could see where fresh chinking had been packed between the logs with careful attention. A kitchen garden, mostly finished for the season, occupied a neat rectangle on the south side of the cabin. A milk goat was tethered near the well, and 3 hens moved about in a small pen made of salvaged wood and wire. It was a meager homestead, but it had the unmistakable quality of being cared for by someone who took seriously the difference between surviving and living. He dismounted at the fence, There was a fence now, he noticed, a modest one of thin posts and 2 strands of wire that had not been there before, and he called out before approaching, because that was the manner in which a decent man approached the home of a woman living alone. "Hello to the house." There was a pause, and then the cabin door opened. The woman who stepped out was not what he had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had been expecting. She was taller than average, slim, but with the capable, unhurried quality of someone who has learned to use her body for actual work. Her hair was the color of dark honey, thick and loosely pinned at the back of her neck, with strands escaping to frame a face that was striking rather than conventionally pretty strong cheekbones, a determined jaw, and eyes of a remarkable shade of hazel that held, in Jeremiah's first encounter with them, a wariness that was not unfriendly but was absolutely clear. She was wearing a work dress with an apron over it, and she was drying her hands on the apron as she stepped into the yard, and there was about her whole bearing the quality of a person who has spent a significant amount of time being entirely self-reliant and finds it more comfortable than not. "Mr. Sutton," she said, and her voice was lower and steadier than he had imagined. The wariness in her eyes had not disappeared, but she was measuring him with a fair and level attention. "Miss Ford," he said, and then corrected himself. "Mrs. Ford, my apologies." "Miss is fine," she said. "I have been using Miss again for some time now. What can I do for you?" He stood at the fence with his hat in his hands and discovered that he had not fully planned what he was going to say. He had ridden out with a vague intention of being a responsible landowner and addressing the situation of someone occupying his property without arrangement, but standing in front of her with those measuring eyes on him, the prepared speech dissolved into something more honest. "I came to make sure you are all right," he said. "I heard about the roof." Something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but recalibrating. "Your wife spoke to me at the market," she said carefully. "I am not married," he said. She absorbed this information with a slight tilt of her head. "I see. Who told you about the roof then?" "Rodrigo's wife, Consuela. Her husband works on my ranch." "She was at the market the same Saturday." Ellen Ford nodded slowly. "The roof is manageable," she said. "I thank you for coming, Mr. Sutton, but I am not in need of charity." He had expected this somehow. "I am not offering charity," he said. "I am the landowner and you are living on my land, and if something on my land needs fixing, it is my concern. That is not charity, that is property maintenance." She looked at him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she was reading something in him that he had not meant to show. "You could ask me to leave," she said. "That would also be property maintenance." "I could," he agreed. "I am not going to." Another moment of measurement. Then she stepped back and pushed the gate open. "I suppose you might as well come and look at the roof then," she said, "since you have ridden out." He tied his horse to the fence post and went through the gate, and she walked him around the south side of the cabin and pointed to where 2 log lengths of the roof had settled unevenly, leaving a gap that she had stuffed with straw and old canvas, but which would not hold against serious winter rain or snow. She had done the pointing with the matter-of-fact tone of an engineer describing a problem, and he crouched and looked and prodded the wood with his thumb and told her his honest assessment, which was that it needed 2 new lengths of timber and proper seating before the first hard freeze. "I can send Pete Dawes out with the timber," he said, standing. "And the cost?" she asked immediately. He looked at her directly for the first time, long enough that she held the gaze without flinching. "There is no cost," he said. "As I said, property maintenance." She did not thank him extravagantly. She said, "I am grateful, Mr. Sutton," with a straightness that he found he respected enormously, and then she said, "Would you take a cup of coffee before you ride back?" He almost said no. He was not sure why he almost said no, except that there was something about standing in this woman's yard that made him feel unaccountably nervous in a way he had not felt in years, and his instinct was to treat unaccountable nervousness the way he treated most uncomfortable things, by putting distance between himself and its source. But the day was gray and cold, and the ride back was a good half hour, and he heard himself say, "Thank you, I would." Inside, the cabin was small but remarkably ordered. She had made it a home with the same methodical care she had applied to everything else: a clean rag rug on the swept floor, a shelf of books along one wall, jars of preserved food arranged with military precision on the kitchen shelf. The books surprised him. He counted them involuntarily. There were 11 of them. She put the coffee pot on the stove and they sat at the small table, and the conversation that followed was not what either of them would have predicted. It was supposed to be brief and courteous and lead naturally to his departure. Instead, they talked for over an hour. She had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a school teacher, and had come west with her husband Thomas Ford, who had been a man of optimistic ambitions and poor constitution, which was a combination that the West generally found less charming than the East did. He had died of lung fever in the winter of 1876, leaving her with a rented farm and debts, and the slow, complicated grief of mourning, a man you had loved while also acknowledging that his decisions had made your life extremely difficult. She did not say this last part aloud, but Jeremiah heard it anyway in the spaces between what she did say, because he was a man who had learned to listen to silences. She asked about the ranch with a practical curiosity that was clearly genuine. How many acres? What he ran? Whether he owned the water rights to the creek. He answered with more thoroughness than he usually applied to explaining himself to anyone, because her questions were good ones, specific and informed, and it was a pleasure to be asked good questions. When he finally rose to leave, the gray afternoon had deepened toward early dark, and he stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands and felt, quite unexpectedly, as though he had spent the afternoon in the company of someone interesting. It was not a feeling he had about people often. "I will send Pete out with the timber on Saturday," he said. "Thank you," she said. He rode home through the cold Kansas twilight and told himself that was that. He was wrong. Pete came back from the roof repair with the kind of elaborate neutrality on his face that Jeremiah had learned over 12 years of association, meant the older man had something to say but was choosing his moment. He chose it at supper after the dishes were cleared. "She is a good hand with tools," Pete said, into his coffee cup. "Did a fair portion of the work herself while I was up on the roof. Sensible." "Good," Jeremiah said. Pete turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "She showed me the garden she is planning for spring. Good layout. She knows what she is doing with land." "Pete," Jeremiah said. "I am just telling you what I observed," Pete said with total innocence. November arrived and with it the first serious cold, and Jeremiah found himself riding the eastern fence line more frequently than he strictly needed to. He acknowledged this to himself without fuss, because he was not a man who found comfort in self-deception. He was riding the eastern fence line more than was necessary, because there was a woman on the other side of it who interested him, and he was not yet sure what to do with that information. He saw her once, working in the remains of her kitchen garden, turning the soil for what she had told him during their coffee conversation. She was planning to plant in spring, a larger plot, with winter wheat in the northern section if the soil tested right. She did not see him, or if she did, she gave the same sign she had given in July. He rode on without stopping, because riding past her property without intruding on her felt more honest than stopping without a legitimate reason. He needed a legitimate reason. He thought about this with more concentration than was probably dignified. The reason arrived in the form of a problem he genuinely had. He had purchased a new herd of 50 cattle in November, and needed to push them through the eastern pasture to reach the northern section where he had laid winter feed, which meant driving them past the edge of the old Harding cabin's fence line. It was a practical concern that she ought to know about, so that her goat and hens were not disturbed by a cattle drive passing within 100 yards of them. He rode out on a gray November morning and found her splitting wood outside the cabin, swinging the maul with a competence that stopped him for a moment before he announced himself. She was wearing a heavy coat and a knit scarf, and there was color in her cheeks from the cold and from the work, and when she turned at the sound of his horse and saw who it was, Something in her face did what he could only describe as recognizing him, the way a person recognizes someone they were already thinking about. He told her about the cattle drive. She thanked him for the warning and said she would secure the goat on the far side of the cabin on that day. Then she leaned on the maul and looked at him with those honest hazel eyes and said, "You have ridden out here 3 times in 3 weeks, Mr. Sutton. I want to make sure I understand why." He respected this so much that he nearly said so. Instead he said, "I find I am more interested in my eastern fence line than I used to be." She was quiet for a moment. "I see," she said carefully. "I do not want to make you uncomfortable," he said, which was the truest thing he had said in a long time. She looked at him for a moment that stretched into 2. "You are not making me uncomfortable," she said finally. "I just wanted to know what we were talking about." "So did I," he admitted. She almost smiled. It was there at the corner of her mouth, held back by some habitual restraint, and he wanted to say something that would bring it fully into the open, but he did not yet know her well enough to know how. "I was about to make lunch," she said. "If you have eaten, you are welcome to come in anyway. If you haven't, I have soup on." He had not eaten. He went in. They ate soup at her small table and talked, and this time the conversation moved differently than it had the first time. They had already established that each was a person worth talking to, and so they moved forward from that premise directly. She told him about the books on her shelf. She was reading a history of the Roman Republic that her father had sent her, and she had opinions about it that were pointed and well-reasoned. He told her about the trouble he had been having with the water rights on the Eastern Creek, which had been contested by a neighbor downstream named Garrett Bly, who had been petitioning the county with some persistence. She listened to this with the same sharp attention she gave everything else and then said, "Have you filed a counterclaim with the same surveyor who did your original property line? Because the water rights should be documented in that survey if the creek runs through your land." He stared at her. "They are," he said slowly. "I have the survey documents." "Then you have your answer," she said and shrugged and went back to her soup. He filed the documentation with the county clerk the following week, and the water rights dispute was resolved within 10 days. He told Rodrigo about this on a Friday morning while they were working together to repair a section of the barn roof, and Rodrigo, who was the least subtle man Jeremiah had ever employed, said without looking up from the shingles he was nailing, "She sounds smart." "She is extremely smart," Jeremiah said. Rodrigo nailed another shingle. "Consuela would like to have her for Sunday dinner," he said. "I am asked to mention this." "Mention it to her yourself," Jeremiah said. "I will mention it to you first," Rodrigo said serenely, "and you can bring her." Jeremiah said that was presumptuous, and Rodrigo said that Consuela was always presumptuous, and it generally worked out, and Jeremiah went back to the shingles and said nothing more but did not specifically say no. It took him a week to build up to asking her. He rode out on a Wednesday afternoon with the thin excuse of checking that the roof repair was holding, and stood at her gate in the early December cold feeling approximately 16 years old, and asked if she would like to come to Sunday dinner at Rodrigo and Consuela's house. Ellen Ford looked at him from her doorway with an expression that was equal parts amusement and something more serious underneath it. "That is very formal," she said. "Are you asking me to meet your friends, Mr. Sutton?" "I believe I am," he said. "Then yes," she said simply. "I would like that." He picked her up on Sunday in the ranch wagon, which he had cleaned for the first time since Rodrigo's wedding the previous year. She came out of the cabin wearing a dark green wool dress that he had not seen before, and she had done her hair more carefully than usual, and she climbed up onto the wagon seat with the total self-possession of a woman who has decided to commit to a direction. They drove to Rodrigo and Consuela's small house south of town through the brittle winter sunshine, and the conversation between them on that drive was easy in a way that surprised him. The particular ease of 2 people who have established a frequency of understanding and fall into it naturally. Consuela received Ellen with the warm efficiency of someone who has been preparing for this meeting for some time and would never admit it. Rodrigo shook her hand and said, "He talks about you," which caused Jeremiah to experience a very specific mortification. But Ellen only looked at Rodrigo with a slight smile and said, "Does he?" And the comment seemed to settle something in her rather than unsettle it. Dinner was wonderful. Consuela cooked with the same generous abundance she brought to everything, and the four of them sat around the table in that small, warm house for 3 hours, talking and eating and laughing in a way that Jeremiah had not laughed in a very long time. Ellen held her own in that gathering with total ease, trading stories with Consuela about the particular challenges of keeping a kitchen garden in Kansas soil, listening to Rodrigo's account of the cattle they had sold in November with genuine interest, asking questions that drew people out rather than showing off her own knowledge. By the end of the evening, Consuela had taken Ellen's hand in both of hers and said with her typical directness, "You must come every Sunday," and Ellen had said she would be honored, and the matter was settled. On the drive home, with the stars very bright in the cold December sky and the horses moving steadily through the dark prairie, Ellen sat beside him on the wagon seat and they were quiet together for a while in a way that was comfortable rather than empty. Then she said, "Your friends are wonderful people." "They are," he agreed. "You are lucky," she said, and there was something in it that was not quite wistfulness but was in that neighborhood. "Do you have family?" he asked. He had been careful not to press her on anything personal, waiting for the information to come in its own time, but the question seemed natural in the dark with the stars overhead and the comfortable intimacy of the evening still around them. "My father is in Ohio," she said. "We write. My mother died when I was 12. A pause. Thomas's family never much cared for me, so there was no great loss there when I moved on." He thought about this, about what it cost to say it in that neutral tone. "I have a sister in Missouri," he said. "Margaret. She has 3 children and a husband who is mostly good and occasionally an idiot. She writes every month." Ellen laughed softly. It was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, and it was a warm and genuine sound that reached into his chest and did something there that he was not entirely prepared for. "That sounds like most marriages," she said. "Is that how yours was?" he asked. She considered this for a long moment. "Thomas was not an idiot," she said. "He was kind and he tried very hard. He just wanted the world to be different than it was, and he put a great deal of energy into that wanting. He loved me the best he could." She paused. "That is the most honest thing I can say about it." "I think that is a kind thing to say about someone who is gone," Jeremiah said. She looked at him then in the darkness, and he could not quite see her expression, but he felt the attention of it like a weight. "What about you?" she asked. "Have you been married?" He told her about Clara briefly and without drama, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "7 years is a long time to carry something alone." "I was not carrying it," he said. "I set it down." "Where did you set it?" she asked, and there was a gentleness in the question that undid something in him. He thought about it honestly. "In the work," he said. "In the land." "The land is faithful," she said, and it was not a judgment but an understanding, and he felt it as such. He pulled the wagon up to the gate of the cabin and helped her down, and they stood for a moment in the cold yard under the winter stars. He could see the frost on the grass catching the moonlight, and her breath making a small cloud in the cold air, and the whole scene had the quality of something very still and very significant, though he could not have explained the significance in words. "Thank you for the evening," she said. "Thank you for coming," he said. She went inside, and he drove home through the cold dark with something warm moving around in his chest that he was not quite ready to name. December pulled them toward each other with the patient inevitability of a river finding its level. He came to see her twice a week, and then 3 times a week, and the visits lengthened from practical exchanges to long afternoons and evenings of conversation that ranged across every subject either of them had ever thought about. He discovered that she had opinions about the treatment of the Cheyenne people who had been pushed off their lands in the territory to the south. Opinions that were sharp and clear and morally uncompromising in a way that made him examine his own thoughts on the subject with more honesty than he had previously applied to them. She was right, and she said so without apology, and he told her she was right. The violence and dispossession that had driven whole peoples from lands they had inhabited for generations was not something that could be reasoned away with the language of progress. And sitting at her small table while the winter wind moved against the walls of the cabin, he felt the weight of that truth in a way that was not comfortable but was necessary. She discovered his library, which was more extensive than she had expected when he invited her to the main ranch house for the first time in late December. He had a full wall of books, accumulated over 20 years of ordering from catalogs and receiving them from his sister at Christmas, and she stood in front of that wall with the expression of someone who has unexpectedly found something they were not certain still existed in the world. "I thought I had the only books in 20 miles," she said. "You have 11, he said. "I have counted." She turned to look at him with an expression that was the full version of the almost smile he had been seeing since October, and it was better than he had imagined. "You counted my books." He was not sorry to have been caught. "I noticed them," he said, with all possible dignity. "You counted them," she said, and the smile spread fully across her face, and he knew in that moment with absolute certainty that he was in serious trouble, the very best kind. Christmas that year was the first holiday in many years that Jeremiah had not spent in the quiet company of Pete, and a bottle of good whiskey, and the comfortable melancholy of a man who has made his peace with solitude. Consuela organized a proper Christmas gathering that included her sister's family who had come up from the settlement, and Pete, who accepted social occasions with a resigned good grace, and Ellen, who arrived with a jar of her preserved summer peaches and a loaf of bread she had baked that morning. There was music after dinner. Consuela's brother-in-law played the fiddle with tremendous enthusiasm, if not always technical precision, and Rodrigo pushed back the furniture, and there was dancing in the small, warm room. And Jeremiah, who was not a natural dancer but was not a coward, asked Ellen if she would dance with him. She stood and gave him her hand, and they danced in the crowded, joyful room with the fiddle playing and the people laughing around them. And when the press of the dance brought her closer to him, she did not pull away, and her hand in his was warm and certain. The fiddle slowed and the dance slowed with it, and they were standing very close together in the warm room, and she looked up at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something open and unguarded, and he thought, quite clearly, that he was going to tell her how he felt very soon, and that this thought did not frighten him the way he might have expected. January in Kansas was serious business, and the cold that month was as cold as Jeremiah could remember, the kind that got into the ground and stayed there and made the mornings ring like iron. He worried about Ellen in the cabin, which was small and old, and he told her she was welcome to come to the main house if the weather became more than the cabin stove could manage. She thanked him and said she would manage, and she did, though he rode out every other day to check on her and found her each time sensibly occupied in the things that needed doing and disinclined to dramatize her situation. One January morning, he arrived at the cabin to find her outside in the bitter cold trying to free her water pump, which had frozen solid in the night. She had been at it for a while already, and her hands were red, and her breath was coming fast from the effort, and he got down from his horse without a word and took over from her with the tools she had, and between them they got the pump freed in 20 minutes. She made hot coffee, and they stood in the cabin warming their hands, and he noticed for the first time that her right hand had a small scar along the thumb that spoke of some old accident with a blade or a tool, and he wanted to ask about it, and the wanting to know all the small stories of her body and her life was so strong and so sudden that it silenced him for a moment. She noticed his silence. She was always noticing things. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how I have not said something I should say," he said, with a care that was not quite casualness. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at him with those clear hazel eyes. She waited, "I think you know," he said, which was perhaps not the most eloquent approach, but it was honest. "I might know," she said carefully. "I would rather hear it said." He set his cup down. "I am in love with you," he said, and the simplicity of it surprised him even as he said it, the way the truest things are always simpler than you expect. "I have been working my way toward saying that for at least 2 months, probably longer. You are the most remarkable person I have met in as long as I can remember, and I am in love with you." The color in her face from the cold had not entirely faded, and now there was something else in it too, something that had been held very carefully in reserve and was now, very slowly, being allowed out into the light. "I came down here last winter not knowing what I was looking for," she said. "I found this empty cabin at the edge of the world and I thought, I will put my head down and I will build something and I will stop wanting anything I don't already have." She paused. "And then a man came to my gate in October and argued with me about property maintenance and counted my books." "I maintain that I noticed them," Jeremiah said. "You counted them," she said, and the smile was in her voice now, and then she was looking at him with something so direct and warm and sure that he felt it like the sun on his face after a long cold. "I love you too, Jeremiah," she said. "I have been quite stubbornly trying not to for some time." He crossed the small space between them and took her face in his hands, and she looked up at him and did not look away, and he kissed her in the warmth of the January cabin, with the cold pressing at the walls outside and the coffee going quietly cold on the table, and she kissed him back with the same quality of total commitment she brought to everything else she did, and it was better than anything he had imagined, and he had imagined it rather more than was probably sensible. When they finally separated, she rested her forehead briefly against his chest, and he put his arms around her, and they stood like that in the small, warm cabin for a long moment while the winter wind moved around the walls outside. "You have been living on the edge of my land for nearly a year," he said against her hair. "I have," she said. "That is an extraordinary thing not to have paid attention to sooner," he said. She laughed into his chest, the warm, genuine laugh he had been collecting since December. "You are paying attention now," she said. "I am," he said. "I intend to be very thorough about it going forward." February announced its arrival with a blizzard that kept everyone on the Sutton Ranch indoors for 3 days. And when the world was white and still, and the sky, a hard, brilliant blue afterward, Jeremiah dug out the path to the barn and fed the horses and came back inside to find that Pete had made a pot of something that called itself stew, and was watching him with the expression of a man who has been waiting for the other boot to drop for quite some time. "She is a good woman," Pete said, which was the most direct thing he had said in 12 years. "She is," Jeremiah agreed. Pete nodded and went back to his stew. The question of Ellen's living arrangement was the next practical matter, and it was one that occupied Jeremiah's thoughts with more urgency as February progressed. He was 32 years old and she was 26, and what he wanted from his life had become very clear in a way it had not been for a long time. He was not a man who moved slowly when he had made up his mind. The problem was that Ellen was a woman of independent spirit and specific pride, and he did not want to propose something she would interpret as absorption rather than partnership. He thought about this for 2 weeks, which was more thinking than he normally did before any decision, and then one evening in late February he rode out to the cabin and sat across from her at the table and said, "I want to talk to you about something." "You have had a specific expression for 2 weeks," she said. "I have been waiting." "Have you?" he said. "What is it?" she asked. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "but I want to do it in a way that is honest about what I mean and what I am not meaning." She tilted her head slightly. She was listening with her full attention, the way she listened to everything. "I am not asking you because I want to solve a problem," he said. "I'm not asking because the cabin needs work, or because it would be more practical, or because you need to be taken care of, because you have made it quite clear you are capable of taking care of yourself. I am asking because I want to spend my life with you, because I want to talk to you every morning and every evening, and because I want to watch you plant your kitchen garden and argue with me about the Roman Republic and read every book in my library and then probably order more." He paused. "I would like to offer you the east field for the wheat you talked about in the fall. It is better soil than what is around the cabin, and it's yours to work as you see fit. The cabin itself, I would like you to decide what happens with it. We could keep it as a place to work or tear it down for the timber, whichever you prefer, but the decision is yours." She was very still across the table from him. Her hands were flat on the table and her eyes were very bright. "I want you to be my wife," he said. "Not because it is practical, though it is, but because you are the person I want to be with. That is all I have." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is considerably more than all." "Is it enough?" he asked. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Jeremiah, it is more than enough." He exhaled something that he had apparently been holding in his chest for approximately 2 months. "The east field," she said after a moment with a different quality in her voice, practical and pleased at once. "Better soil," he confirmed. "And the cabin," she said. "Your decision," he said. She thought about it. "Keep it," she said. "I want somewhere to go when you are being difficult." He smiled at this, his full smile, which Pete had once told him arrived so rarely it startled people. "I am very rarely difficult." "You are consistently difficult," she said, smiling back at him, "and I love you for it." The wedding was in March, when the first green was coming up through the winter-flattened grass, and the sky was doing its best impression of the future. They were married in the small Methodist church in Caldwell by a minister named Reverend Holt, who was a lean and thoughtful man who clearly found the pair of them interesting. And the wedding party consisted of Pete, who wore his good hat, and Rodrigo and Consuela, who wept in the happy and productive way that Consuela brought to significant events, and Consuela's sister's family, and the dry goods merchant Millerson, who had been, in his way, the first person in town to remark on Ellen Ford's good character, and felt some proprietary pleasure in the outcome. Jeremiah's sister Margaret had written back by express post when she received his letter, a letter of such enthusiastic warmth and several specific pieces of advice that neither he nor Ellen had requested, that they had both read it at the kitchen table laughing until they had to stop and collect themselves. She would come to visit in summer, she promised. She was bringing the children. Ellen Ford became Ellen Sutton on a Thursday morning in March 1879, and when she took his arm after the ceremony and walked with him out into the clean prairie sunshine, she looked up at him with a private smile that was for him alone, and he knew that he had not understood, in all his years of working the land and building a life from the raw material of this wide and difficult country, that the whole business had been tending toward this. Spring arrived with its full generosity. Ellen moved the last of her things from the cabin to the main house, which was a larger and more comfortable structure than she had been accustomed to, and she moved through it with the same practical attention she had brought to the small cabin, making it a home in the specific ways that she understood home to mean the rag rugs in front of the stove, the books reorganized on the shelf to integrate with his, the kitchen garden planned and laid out on the south side of the house rather than the east, because the south-facing light was better, and she had done the arithmetic on it. Her books mixed with his on the shelf, and they began the habit of reading aloud to each other in the evenings, which was not something Jeremiah had ever done with another person, and which he found, to his complete surprise, to be one of the most intimate things two people could share. The quiet act of one voice carrying a story into the evening air while the other listened, and the fire settled in the grate. The east field was broken and planted with winter wheat in April, and Jeremiah watched her work it with the same attention he brought to watching any craftsperson, the way she assessed the soil, the way she laid out the rows with a string line and wooden stakes for precision, the way she moved through the work without wasted motion. She had learned farming from necessity, but she had made it into something more than survival, and the east field by June was standing green and full in the warm Kansas sunshine. Pete Dawes, who had been watching all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been right about something without having said so directly, remarked one morning over coffee that the east field looked better than anything the Sutton Ranch had grown in the north section. "It does," Jeremiah agreed. "She knows her soil," Pete said. "She knows everything," Jeremiah said, with a simplicity that caused Pete to look at him with an expression of warm bemusement that was as close as Pete generally got to sentiment. In the early days of their marriage, they were still learning the particular grammar of each other's daily selves, the small habits and preferences and moods that you only discover in the continuous proximity of shared life. Jeremiah learned that she was at her sharpest and most herself in the mornings, that she liked to sit on the porch with her first cup of coffee in the early light before the day's work began, and simply be still for a few minutes, and that interrupting this ritual was ill-advised. She learned that he became quieter when he was worried rather than louder, which was the inverse of what she had expected, and that the way to reach him when he went quiet was to sit beside him with her own silence until he found his way back to words. They had their first disagreement in April, over the question of whether to take on a contract with a cattle buyer in Dodge City that Jeremiah had been considering. She thought the terms were unfavorable, and said so with her characteristic directness. He had already been leaning toward refusing the contract, but had not yet made up his mind, and found himself unexpectedly defensive about being told something he already knew. They argued with the specific heat of two people who are both right and know it, and the argument circled for a while, and then resolved itself in the way that arguments between two honest people generally do. They both said more clearly what they actually thought. The real shape of the disagreement became visible, and it turned out to be much smaller than the argument had suggested. He refused the contract. The terms were not good enough. She did not say "I told you so," which he noted and appreciated. "You could say it," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm choosing not to." He looked at her and felt a warmth in his chest that was compounded of love and respect in equal measure. "I am going to be difficult sometimes," he said. "I know that too," she said. "I have resources." The cabin, she reminded him, was still standing. He laughed and pulled her toward him and kissed her temple, and she turned and kissed him back properly, and the disagreement was thoroughly over. Summer brought Margaret from Missouri with her 3 children, boys of 9 and 6, and a girl of 4, who immediately attached herself to Ellen with the uncomplicated adoration of very small children for people who treat them as complete persons. Margaret was tall and brown-haired and laughed like Jeremiah, which was to say infrequently but totally, and she met Ellen with an assessment that was warmly disguised but genuinely thorough, and rendered her verdict within 24 hours by taking Ellen's arm while walking back from the garden and saying, "My brother has been lonely for years. I am very glad you are here," with a directness that Ellen matched exactly. "So am I," Ellen said. Margaret's husband David came a few days after, having settled his affairs at home, and he was a cheerful and mildly hapless man who was clearly much improved by Margaret's management, and had the self-awareness to acknowledge this, which Jeremiah privately considered an underrated quality in a husband. David helped with the haying with more enthusiasm than skill, and was genuinely useful when his enthusiasm was directed toward work he understood. And in the evenings, the whole household gathered on the porch or around the table, and the sound of it was a kind of fullness that Jeremiah had not known was missing until it arrived. The trouble with Garrett Bly came to a head in August and required more direct attention than the water rights paperwork had. Bly was a neighbor whose land bordered the Sutton Ranch to the south, and he was a man who had always operated on the assumption that the world was a competition, and that any ground not actively contested was ground ceded. The water rights resolution had not been received well by Bly, who had been relying on the ambiguity of the situation for his own irrigation purposes, and through the summer there had been a series of smaller provocations. A Sutton fence post pulled up and moved 3 yards in Bly's favor. A gate left open that let some of the Sutton horses wander into Bly's south pasture and damaged his fencing, the kind of petty territorial aggression that stopped just short of anything actionable. Jeremiah had been managing this with patience and documentation, recording each incident and its date, and the material damage involved. Ellen had encouraged this approach from the beginning. "Do not give him a reason to escalate," she had said. "A man like that wants you angry. When you are angry, you make mistakes. When you are calm and you have records, you win." In August, Bly made the mistake of making the dispute personal rather than merely territorial. He appeared at the Sutton Ranch gate on a Saturday afternoon with two of his hired men and maid. In a voice loud enough to be heard by Pete and Rodrigo, who were working nearby, certain suggestions about the impropriety of a woman who had been living alone on a man's land without arrangement, and what such a woman's character likely was. Jeremiah walked to the gate with the absolute quietness that those who knew him recognized as the specific warning that something was about to become very clear very quickly. He said, in a voice of complete control, "Mr. Bly, you will not speak about my wife in that manner. You have said this in front of witnesses, and I want to be sure you understand what you have done. You have my documentation of your fence violations and your property incursions and your water theft, and I have been patient because I prefer things settled in a civil manner. I am going to the county courthouse on Monday morning. I suggest you speak with a lawyer before then." Bly went red and blusterous, but Jeremiah had already turned and walked back to the house, and the two hired men had been watching Pete and Rodrigo with the pragmatic assessment of men who understand what they are looking at, and nobody made any additional remarks. He went inside and found Ellen at the kitchen table with her hands very still on the wood surface, and her jaw set in a way that told him she had heard everything from the window. "I am sorry he said that," Jeremiah said. "I have been called worse," she said, in a tone that was controlled but not fully controlled, and he sat down beside her and took both her hands in his. "No," he said, "not while you are my wife and not on my land. Not ever if I have anything to say about it." She looked at him for a moment with something raw and genuine in her face. Then she said, "I know." The courthouse filing resulted in a formal complaint and a hearing that was attended by both parties 3 weeks later, and the county judge was a gruff but fair man named Abernathy who had little patience for the kind of petty territorial bullying that wasted his time and the county's resources. The documentation that Jeremiah presented, aided significantly by Ellen's meticulous organizational work on the papers the night before, was thorough and clear, and Bly's counterarguments were thin and inconsistent. Judge Abernathy ruled in Sutton's favor on every point and assessed Bly for damages, and warned him with the particular clarity of a man who does not repeat himself that any further interference with his neighbor's property would be met with consequences that Bly would find considerably more inconvenient than a courthouse visit. Bly sold his ranch the following spring and moved on, which was the best possible outcome, and one that Ellen had predicted with a calmness that Jeremiah found, even in retrospect, impressive. The autumn of 1879 was the most beautiful Jeremiah could remember. The wheat came in well from the east field, better than he had projected, and the money from the harvest was enough to make some improvements to the ranch that he had been delaying: new fencing along the north boundary, a second storage barn, and a proper smokehouse that Ellen had been wanting since spring. They built the smokehouse together over 2 October weekends, and it was, Jeremiah reflected afterward, one of the happiest 4 days of his life. Working alongside her with the clean autumn air around them, and the cottonwood trees along the creek burning gold and the whole wide sky of Kansas overhead, handing boards and driving nails and arguing companionably about the placement of the vent and the hanging configuration for the meat hooks. By the end of the second Sunday, they had a solid, well-built smokehouse, and they stood looking at it with the shared satisfaction of two people who have made something real with their hands. "It is very good," she said. "Better than what I would have done alone," he said honestly. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood in the autumn light looking at the smokehouse for a long, quiet moment. "I am going to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I am going to have a baby," she said. He was very still for a moment, and then he turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, fully open in a way he rarely let his face be, something profound and undefended moving through it. "When?" he said. "May I think," she said. He put both arms around her then, carefully, and she rested her face against his chest, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing they needed to say that the holding was not already saying. Pete took the news with his characteristic stoicism, which Jeremiah recognized as the most thoroughgoing expression of pleasure the man possessed. He said, "Good," and went back to the tack he was oiling, and that evening he presented Ellen with a pair of knitted socks of evidently recent making that he said were for the cold floors and nothing else. Consuela cried. Rodrigo lifted Jeremiah off the ground briefly in a bare embrace that was technically a dignity violation, but that Jeremiah was willing to forgive. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was the winter Jeremiah later described, when he was old and his grandchildren asked him about his life, as the winter he understood what he had been building toward all along. Ellen was pregnant and warm and full of opinions, and she was reading through his medical almanac with an alarming thoroughness, and had compiled a list of questions for the doctor in Caldwell that covered 4 pages of her neat handwriting. She was not frightened, or if she was, she had evaluated the fear and found it manageable and moved forward, which was entirely consistent with how she handled everything. In the evenings they sat by the fire and he read to her from whatever book they were in the middle of, and she would sometimes fall asleep in the chair, and he would sit watching her in the firelight with a feeling of such complete and unqualified happiness that it seemed almost too large to hold. One evening in January she was awake and watching the fire, and she said, without looking at him, "I think about the year before you came to the gate sometimes, when I was just living out there on the edge of your land." "What do you think about it?" he asked. "I think about how it is possible to be very close to something you need and not know it," she said. "I was right there all that time and neither of us knew." She looked at him. "Does that seem strange to you?" "No," he said. "I think some things take as long as they take. You were right there and I needed to be ready before I could see it properly." "Were you ready?" she asked. He thought about it seriously because she deserved a serious answer. "Not until October," he said, "when I rode out to argue about property maintenance." She smiled at this. "You were terrible at the argument," she said. "I know," he said. "I was distracted." "By what?" she asked, though she knew. "By you," he said simply. In April, Jeremiah rode to Wichita for supplies and came back with, among the practical items on the list, a small wooden rocking horse that he had seen in the window of a toy maker's shop and had purchased on impulse, which was not a thing he generally did. Ellen received this with the full smile and something luminous behind it, and she put it in the corner of the room they had been preparing, and they stood in the doorway of the nursery together looking at it. "It is a boy's horse," she observed. "It works for either," he said. "I think it is a boy," she said. "Do you know, or are you guessing?" he asked. "I am making an informed assessment," she said, which was so exactly like her that he laughed. On the 14th of May, 1880, with Consuela in attendance and the doctor from Caldwell who had ridden out at first light, Ellen gave birth to a son. The labor was long and serious, and Jeremiah spent the hours of it in the kitchen and the yard and the kitchen again, with the specific helpless agony of a man who would do anything to take a burden from someone he loves, and has absolutely nothing to offer except his presence and his prayers. Pete sat with him for much of it without speaking, which was the most useful thing any person could have done. At 10 in the morning the baby's cry came through the wall and Jeremiah stood up from the kitchen table so quickly the chair fell behind him, and Consuela appeared in the doorway with a shining face and said, "A boy. Strong. Come." Ellen was exhausted and luminous and entirely herself, and she put the baby into Jeremiah's arms with a trust that undid him completely, and he stood holding his son in the morning light that came through the bedroom window and felt something settle into place in him that had been loosely joined for 32 years. "Samuel," she said. "What do you think?" "Samuel," he repeated, and it was right. Samuel Sutton came into the world with strong lungs and dark hair, and an expression of frowning consideration that Consuela said was exactly his father, and that Pete received with the expression of a man who is profoundly moved and intends to say absolutely nothing about it. Margaret came in June and stayed 3 weeks and held Samuel with the expert efficiency of a woman with 3 children of her own, and told Ellen things about the early months of a baby's life that the medical almanac had not covered, and that turned out to be extremely useful. Margaret and Ellen had the particular friendship of two intelligent women who recognize each other immediately and settle into ease, and by the end of the 3 weeks, they were writing letters with the frequency of people who have been friends all their lives. The summer Samuel was born was the summer the ranch began to feel complete in a way it had never quite been before. It was not that there was no work. There was always work, the endless productive labor of a working cattle ranch in the Kansas grasslands, the fence lines and the water rights and the cattle sales and the grain harvest and the 1,000 daily tasks that constituted the life they had chosen. But the work had a different quality now, a purposefulness that was not merely about survival or building for its own sake, but about making something that would last, something worth the handing down. Ellen went back to the East Field in July with Samuel in a sling against her chest, and she assessed the soil for the fall planting with the same focused attention she had always given it. And Jeremiah rode past on his way to the north section, and saw her standing in the field with the baby against her chest, and the late summer sky enormous overhead. And the sight of it was so beautiful and so completely right that he stopped his horse for a moment just to look at it. The cabin at the edge of the property was still standing. She had put it to good use. She kept her tools there, and the seeds for the east field, and a workbench where she repaired things with a craftsmanship that he had found various excuses to observe with admiration. It was hers as it had always been, and sometimes when he was being difficult she walked out there in the early morning with a cup of coffee, and came back an hour later with the particular expression of someone who has reminded themselves of their own self-sufficiency and found the reminder useful. He never took it personally. He found it, if he was honest, one of the things he loved most about her. That fall, Samuel began to make the preliminary investigations into mobility that would lead to crawling. And Pete, who had established himself as a figure of significant importance in Samuel's life, through the consistent offering of interesting objects and the reliable provision of his own rough beard as a source of endless tactile fascination, reported these developments to Rodrigo with the thoroughness of a man filing an official report. Rodrigo and Consuela announced in September that they were expecting their first child the following spring, and the happiness of this was doubled by Consuela's observation that the children would grow up together and be great friends, which struck everyone present as entirely probable given the friendship of their parents. In October, on the anniversary of the afternoon Jeremiah had ridden to Ellen's gate with his hat in his hands, and his unprepared speech dissolved by the sight of her. He came home from a day of work in the north pasture to find the table set with care, and a good supper keeping warm, and Ellen sitting in the chair by the fire reading to Samuel, who was propped against her leg with an expression of concentrated attention that he directed at everything she said. He stood in the doorway and watched for a moment without announcing himself, and the firelight was on her face, and the child was warm against her side, and outside the windows the October stars were coming up over the Kansas grasslands, and the whole house smelled of supper and wood smoke, and the particular warm living smell of people who have made a home. "You are standing in the doorway," she said, without looking up from the book. "I am," he confirmed. She looked up then, and the smile she gave him was the full, warm, private version, the one that was only his. "Come in, then," she said. "It is cold outside." He came in and closed the door on the October night, and bent to kiss her, and then Samuel, who grabbed his finger with the grip that still amazed him every time. And he sat on the other side of her, and looked at his son and his wife in the firelight, and the words that were in his chest were too large for the available sentences. But that was all right, because she knew them already. The winter of 1880 came in hard and fast and honest, the way Kansas winters did, and the Sutton Ranch was ready for it. The new storage barn held the winter feed well above what was needed, and the smokehouse was full, and the firewood was stacked deep along the north wall of the house, and everything that needed doing before the first hard freeze had been done, because they had done it together. On the first night of the first real blizzard of the season, with the wind outside making the sound that wind makes when it means business and the house tight and warm against it, they put Samuel to bed and came back to the fire, and Ellen picked up her book and then put it down again and looked at him with a particular quality of attention. "What?" he said. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. He knew that particular quality of stillness. "Another baby," he said. "Another baby," she confirmed. He reached for her hand and she gave it, and they sat by the fire with the storm outside and the house warm around them and their sleeping son down the hall and the knowledge of new life between them, and the world was exactly as large and as full as it needed to be. Samuel was walking by the spring of 1881, a project he approached with the total commitment and spectacular indifference to consequences that characterized his every undertaking. And the house rearranged itself around his mobility with the creative urgency that Consuela had predicted, and that proved, if anything, to be an underestimate. Rodrigo and Consuela's daughter Clara was born in April, small and dark-eyed, and already in possession of a personality that Rodrigo said was entirely her mother's and Consuela said was entirely accurate. And the two babies regarded each other across Consuela's kitchen on their first meeting with the serious mutual assessment of people who will spend a great deal of time together and know it. In August of 1881, Ellen gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Ruth, who arrived with her mother's hazel eyes and her father's gray sky intensity, and a general air of having arrived with plans. Samuel received her with the measured tolerance of an almost 2-year-old who has been prepared for something and finds it roughly as described. Pete, presented with a second Sutton child to observe, adjusted his reporting schedule accordingly. The east field had been expanded by this point, with a second section added to the north that Ellen had proposed, and Jeremiah had agreed was the logical extension, and the harvest that fall was the best the ranch had ever produced. They celebrated this at Rodrigo and Consuela's table with a meal that went on for 3 hours and included both families and Pete, and 2 of the hands who had been with the ranch for years. And the children slept on a quilt in the corner, while the adults talked about the season and the coming year, and the small particular details of lives being built in this wide and difficult country. Jeremiah looked down the table at Ellen, who was laughing at something Consuela had said, Ruth drowsing on her shoulder, Samuel asleep on the quilt behind them, and the joy of it was so acute it was almost painful, the way any sufficiency of good things will sometimes present itself as almost more than can be held. She caught his eye down the table, and the look she gave him was the look that was only ever for him, steady and warm and entirely sure. And he held it across the length of the table, and the noise and warmth of the gathering, and felt, as he felt every day, the specific and undiminished gratitude of a man who almost missed the thing he needed most. The years settled into themselves with the steady rhythm of a life that is genuinely good, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary griefs and frustrations and seasons of hard work that make up any honest existence, but deeply and completely good in the way that only comes when the right people have found each other and chosen to build something together. The cabin at the eastern edge of the property stood for many more years, solid and useful, a workshop and a seed store, and occasionally, when the children were old enough to be curious about it, the subject of the story that Jeremiah and Ellen told together about how they had come to be what they were. How she had lived through a Kansas winter alone at the edge of his land, keeping her chickens and her goat and her small fierce fire going, and how he had ridden past the smoke for the better part of a year without doing anything about it, and how eventually, because life has its own timing, and some things take as long as they take, he had ridden to her gate with his hat in his hands, and they had argued about property maintenance. Samuel, when he was old enough to understand the story, said, "You almost missed her." "I did," Jeremiah said. "That would have been terrible," Samuel said, with the frank assessment of childhood. "It would have been the great mistake of my life," Jeremiah said, and he looked at Ellen when he said it, and she looked back at him from across the kitchen table with the smile that had been his since that January morning in the cabin when he had said what needed saying, and there was nothing more that needed to be added to the account. They were 50 miles from the nearest city, on a piece of Kansas grassland that the wind crossed without apology in every season, and the work was never finished, and the winters were serious, and the summers were hard, and the land required everything they had, and then asked for more. And none of that was anything other than the complete fullness of a life lived entirely in the right place, with entirely the right person, in the long and golden middle of a country still figuring out what it was going to be. Jeremiah Sutton had spent years turning his face toward his land, and away from the particular loneliness of a man who has stopped expecting anything from the world beyond what his hands can make. And then one spring morning, a woman had moved into the old Harding cabin at the eastern edge of his property, and she had planted her kitchen garden and mended her roof and built her fence and tended her goat and her chickens, and she had waited not for him. She had not known about him in any useful sense. She had been waiting for nothing except the next day's work, and he had not seen her, or had not been ready to see her. And then one October morning something in him had shifted, and he had ridden east. That was the whole of the mystery, and it was not really a mystery at all. It was only the ordinary miracle of two people finding each other in the wide country, and having the good sense, once found, to hold on. Ellen Sutton planted her winter wheat that fall as she did every fall, and the land gave back what she put into it, and the house was full of the noise of children and the smell of coffee, and the particular quality of warmth that comes from people who genuinely choose each other every day, not dramatically or with great ceremony, but in the small faithful dailiness of a life shared, in the handing of a cup of coffee at the window where the morning light came in the reading aloud by firelight, in the working side by side through the long productive days, in the looking up from wherever you are and finding the other person looking back, and knowing with the sureness of good soil in good hands that you are exactly where you are supposed to be.